Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to do extra practice module 37. And this one's all about the sources and kind of what causes long run economic growth to happen. It's a really interesting little module that kind of summarizes some things. There's one part of it called the Rule of 70 that shows up semi frequently on AP tests. So it's good just to know what it is. And you may have heard of it before in another class or in personal finance if you're doing that part of this class. But it's just kind of a nice summary of what causes long run growth to happen, particularly productivity and how we can encourage that. So the first question for check your understanding, and we'll kind of do that a little bit here, says the economists sometimes focus on real GDP per capita as a measure of economic progress rather than on like just nominal GDP or real GDP in total. And the reason why is why, sorry, my hand's really cold. You ever had that where then your fingers don't like cold? Why real per capita is so that you account for inflation, right? That's the idea of real as opposed to nominal. And the per capita is to account for population. So some countries have very large populations, some have very small. And the whole goal is to think about real GDP per capita is the standard of living of an economy. So your average standard of living would be accounting for population and price levels in the economy. So question 2 says, apply the rule of 70 to the data in figure 37.3 to determine how long it will take each of the countries there to double its real GDP per capita. Would India's real GDP per capita exceed that of the United States in the future if growth rates remain the same? Why or why not? So 37.3, we'll go back a little bit, and this is some economic data about average annual growth rates. And so the rule of 70 is really a doubling time rule, right? And so the idea of it is that you have 70 and you divide it by a percent and it gives you the doubling time. If you're kind of thinking about like if this is a percent in years, then it spits out the value in years. So this is annual growth rates of real GDP per capita. And so just to kind of keep it relatively simple, I'll pull up the calculator here and just do it on here. Oh, now I got to move a bunch of stuff around. Got to move my face, move over there, and move. I'll put my face up here in the corner. So we have 70 divided by 8.8, and that's 8 years, right? So, China, its doubling time is 8 years. And what that means is that their growth rate is so high that they would double the size of their economy every 8 years. So it's an extremely high growth rate. B is India, right? And so we'll do 70 divided by 4.1, and that's 17 years. And now a point here that I'll just kind of mention is that sometimes these are given as the rule of 72, because if you actually do 72 divided by it, then it gives you, it actually gives you a slightly more accurate number just based on it. But 70 is fine for kind of back of the envelope. We could round these as well. But so then Ireland, right? Ireland's doubling time is 18 years. We'll say then the U.S. doubling time. I'm just going to kind of I'm going to round those. So the U.S. would just be 35 years. E, France, we'll do that. Here, 70 divided by 1.5 is 47 years. France doubling time of their economy. And then Argentina, well, Argentina is pretty much one, but we'll run the numbers anyways. We got a calculator, 58 years. And then Zimbabwe, this is going to give us a halving time divided by 1.8, and their economy will actually be cut in half in 39 years. So it's in addition to being a doubling time, it's a halving time as well. Now you might kind of look at that and go, but like, the U.S. economy is huge. How did it get so huge if its doubling time is so slow? And France likewise, and that's because India and China, they started as less developed countries, and they're still kind of more developed. They're on the border, right, between kind of less developed and more developed countries, LDCs and MDCs as they're called. And so in the future, right, if these doubling times hold, then yes, India would eventually exceed it. eventually, yes, right, India would exceed. But the thing about economic growth is that, right, if you start at kind of low, that first initial burst is actually pretty straightforward, and you can leapfrog fairly quickly. But once you've gotten to that more developed status, it's actually quite difficult to continue to grow faster and faster and faster. That's kind of where France and the United States are. Ireland is an exception to that. They're sometimes called the Celtic tiger of Europe because their economy does quite well. It's partly because of their tax policies, and there's a whole host of factors here. Argentina and Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe obviously has some economic problems, so that's why it's negative. And Argentina has its own economic problems, and that's why their growth rate was quite low. But it's also a quite developed country. Number 3, although China and India currently have growth rates much higher than the US, the typical Chinese or Indian household is far poorer than the typical American household. And the explanation is because US GDP per capita, right, is still much higher. And so, if you were to kind of ballpark it and say, Glossinger, how much is that? I think the US GDP per capita is probably around $60,000 per person. And India, I want to say it's about $10,000 a person. And China is similar, a slightly higher value. I want to say maybe 15 or 20,000. So GDP per capita, real GDP per capita, is still kind of the determinant of what that standard of living might look like. Okay, now we'll do. We'll see if I can. Oh no! I don't have to move my face again. Oh man! All right. So now we're going to do the multiple choice, and so. Which of the following is true regarding growth rates for countries around the world compared to the United States? 50% of the world's people live in countries with a lower standard of living than the U.S. in 1908. This is a dumb question. U.S. growth rate is 6 times the growth rate in the rest of the world. No. China has only no. This is a dumb question. So I'm just going to say we're not putting that one in the quiz. Number 2, which of the following is a key statistic used to track economic growth? That one we definitely want to know. And the key statistic used to track economic growth would be real GDP per capita. We're kind of really thinking about per person, how is the economy doing? And so that's really what's key for us on this one. According to the rule of 70, we'll move that over, but not quite so far. If a country's real GDP per capita grows at a rate of 2% per year, how many years will it take to double? 35, because it's 70 divided by 2, so that's C. Number 4, if a country's real GDP per capita doubles in 10 years, what was its average annual growth rate? So if you're thinking about, if you're like, how do we do that? Then some value here, which would be 7, so that's B. And number 5, long-run economic growth depends almost entirely on productivity, B. All righty, let's do our second free response question. So increases in real GDP per capita result mostly from changes in productivity. Productivity. And then it says define that variable, so that's pretty straightforward. Output per worker. So in other words, if your economy is more productive, and often this is actually given as output per worker per hour, so that you kind of really streamline it. And you would say, like, what's the value of the output generated by an American worker in an hour compared to the value of the output of an average Argentinian or the average Indian worker per hour? It's significantly higher, right? And so productivity is pretty key there. What other factor could also lead to increased real GDP per capita? Why is this not as significant? I mean, there are a host of others, right? The human capital, which affects productivity. Physical resources, physical capital. You could say land resources. So literally natural resources. You could also say technology. All of those, though, kind of fuel productivity. The more that you have of these things, the more qualified and quality of your workforce, the more tools, machines, factories, the more natural resources you have, the more technology you have, all of them contribute to greater productivity growth. All right, so hopefully that helps you. I will see you next time.